It started with an emergency. My brother Ryan had been in an accident, a severe one. They took him to St. Mary's Hospital, a place I had only heard about in whispers growing up. It was the kind of place that seemed forgotten by time. The outside was bleak and worn, the windows darkened with years of dust, and it always seemed like there was a fog lingering around it no matter the time of day. People in town referred to it as the hospital that never healed. When I got the call, I rushed over. It was a stormy evening, and the wind howled through the empty streets as I drove up to the hospital. The place looked dead, as if no one had stepped foot inside for years, though the lights inside flickered faintly, suggesting otherwise. I hurried through the rusted front doors and found myself in an eerily quiet waiting room. There was no receptionist. In fact, there wasn't anyone around at all. The chairs were empty, and the overhead lights buzzed dimly. The air felt thick, like the walls were soaked with decades of despair and sickness. I could barely hear my own footsteps as I walked further inside. Something wasn't right. I eventually found an old nurse bent over the counter, looking tired and pale. She glanced up at me with hollow eyes. "I'm here for my brother," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Ryan Carter. He was in an accident." The nurse didn't speak. She merely nodded and pointed down a long hallway. It was dimly lit, and the further I looked down it, the more unsettling it became. The shadows seemed to move in ways they shouldn't, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me from the dark. Still, I had to see my brother. I made my way down the hall, the air growing colder with every step. The walls were lined with old, peeling wallpaper, and I could swear I heard faint whispers, as if the building itself was breathing softly, speaking in low tones that sent chills down my spine. But I shook it off. Hospitals were always creepy at night, I told myself. Room 208. That's where they said Ryan was. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. Inside, the room was bare except for a bed, but it was empty. No machines, no doctors, and worst of all, no Ryan. Confused and growing increasingly uneasy, I stepped further inside. That's when I noticed something odd. On the bed, where the sheets should have been clean, there were dark stains, old dried blood, and what looked like scratch marks running up the wall next to it. I backed out of the room, heart racing now. As I turned to leave, the whispers grew louder. They weren't just random noises anymore. It felt like words, disjointed, fractured sentences that I couldn't fully understand. But they were there. "Leave. Can't escape. Always here." Panic set in. I ran back down the hall, but it seemed longer now, almost stretching before me. The lights flickered as I passed, casting long, unnatural shadows. I called out for help, but the only response was the echo of my own voice bouncing off the cold, sterile walls. I passed by room after room, each one more disturbing than the last. Patients lay in beds, but they weren't moving. Some looked long dead. Others were staring blankly at the ceiling, their mouths slightly open as if frozen mid-scream. I stumbled into the elevator, jamming the button to the ground floor, but the doors wouldn't close. Something wasn't letting me leave. The air inside the elevator felt suffocating, and that's when I saw it, reflected in the metal doors. Behind me, just outside the elevator, was a figure. It was faint, but unmistakably human, pale, skeletal, with eyes that burned into me, hollow and lifeless. I spun around, but there was no one there. The doors finally slid shut, and the elevator jerked downward. The ride was excruciatingly slow, as if the hospital itself didn't want to let me go. When the doors opened again, I was back in the lobby. Or at least it looked like the lobby. It was darker now, the air even colder, and the buzzing of the lights had turned into a low, droning hum. I ran toward the entrance, but it was locked. The old nurse was gone. The place was entirely empty, save for those whispers that followed me, getting louder and more aggressive, almost chanting now. I pounded on the door, shouting for someone, anyone, to help me. But I knew deep down that there was no one there. The hospital had a way of swallowing people whole. That's what they never told us. People went in, but they didn't come out. They became part of it, trapped in its decaying walls, and now I feared I was going to become one of them. As I turned to face the endless hallway behind me, The shadows danced again, taking form, creeping closer. I tried to fight it, but the cold seeped into my bones. The last thing I heard before everything went black was the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. Then silence. There's a building on the outskirts of town that everyone avoids. A decaying hospital that's been abandoned for decades. The windows are shattered, the walls crumbling, and the once pristine halls are now filled with dust and cobwebs. It's the kind of place that makes you feel cold even when you just pass by it. Most people in the town say it's cursed. No one dares go near it, but there are whispers about the dark things that happened inside its walls. When I first heard about the hospital, I was skeptical. I didn't believe in ghosts or curses, but the stories intrigued me. People talked about strange noises coming from inside the building, shadows that moved on their own, and the feeling of being watched if you stood too close. Some even claimed that those who ventured inside never came back. My curiosity got the best of me, and I convinced my friend Luke to explore the hospital with me. It was a cold, misty night, the kind of night where the air feels thick and everything is eerily quiet. We arrived at the hospital just before midnight. The moon was high, casting a pale light over the broken structure, making it look even more sinister than I had imagined. Luke and I stood in front of the rusted gates for a moment, staring at the building. There was something unnerving about the way it loomed over us, like it was alive, waiting. Luke nudged me and said, "You sure about this?" I shrugged, trying to hide my nerves. "Come on, it's just an old building. Let's check it out." We slipped through a gap in the fence and made our way toward the entrance. The door was hanging off its hinges, creaking as we pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the smell of decay hit us immediately. The walls were lined with old medical equipment, some of it overturned, as if the place had been abandoned in a hurry. We wandered down the hall, our footsteps echoing in the silence. The further we went, the darker it got. I pulled out my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, revealing peeling wallpaper and broken tiles. It was hard to believe that this place had once been full of life. Doctors and nurses rushing through the halls, tending to patients. Now it was just a hollow shell. As we moved deeper into the building, strange things started to happen. At first it was subtle, a faint whisper, a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. But then, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath hung in the air in front of me and I could feel something watching us. "Did you hear that?" Luke whispered, his voice shaky. I nodded, shining my flashlight around, trying to find the source of the noise. But there was nothing. Just empty rooms and broken equipment. Still, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. We decided to turn back, but as we made our way toward the exit, the sound of footsteps echoed behind us. We spun around, but there was no one there. "Let's get out of here," Luke said, his voice tight with fear. We quickened our pace, but no matter how fast we walked, the footsteps kept following us, getting closer and closer. Panic set in. We started to run, our footsteps pounding against the floor, but the sound behind us grew louder, like someone or something was chasing us. When we finally reached the front doors, they slammed shut in front of us. Luke grabbed the handle and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. The footsteps stopped, but now there was something else. A low, guttural growl coming from the darkness behind us. I turned around, my heart racing, and that's when I saw it. A shadowy figure standing at the end of the hall, its face twisted and contorted in pain, its eyes burning with hatred. It wasn't human, at least not anymore. We banged on the door, desperate to get out, but it was no use. The figure was getting closer, its growls growing louder. In a final act of desperation, Luke grabbed a metal pipe from the floor and swung it at the door, shattering the glass. We scrambled through the broken window, cutting ourselves on the shards as we tumbled outside. We didn't stop running until we were far from the hospital, our bodies aching and our minds reeling. Whatever was in that building, it wasn't just a ghost. It was something far worse. Something evil. The hospital still stands there today, abandoned and decaying, but I'll never go back. I'll never forget the look in that creature's eyes, the hatred and anger it carried. Some places are cursed, and that hospital is one of them. Whatever dark secret lies within its walls, I hope it stays buried forever. Years had passed since Whitford Hospital shut its doors, but the stories surrounding it never faded. The once thriving hospital was now a decaying, forgotten building, abandoned after a string of mysterious patient deaths and rumors of unethical experiments. People in the town avoided even talking about it. But for Tom and Jacob, two security guards in charge of keeping an eye on the premises for the night, Whitford was just another gig. Or so they thought. The hospital had a contract with a construction company, which meant Tom and Jacob were hired to keep an eye on the place overnight while the crew renovated the front wing. Simple enough, right? But nothing about that place ever felt right. Tom was skeptical but knew Jacob had no patience for ghost stories. It's just an old building. They'll fix it up, sell it off, and we'll move on. Don't let the town gossip get to you, Jacob always said with a smirk, but that night felt different. A cold wind whipped through the corridors, even though all the windows were supposed to be shut. The dim lights of their flashlights barely cut through the heavy darkness. Every step they took seemed to echo longer than it should have. They split up to cover more ground, with Tom taking the lower levels and Jacob heading upstairs to the administrative wing. Tom hated being alone in the basement. The hallways were tight, the air smelled stale, and the fluorescent lights flickered inconsistently. As he walked past the old surgery rooms, something caught his eye. A flicker of movement in one of the rooms ahead. He quickened his pace, hoping it was nothing more than a stray animal or his own imagination playing tricks on him. Suddenly, his radio crackled to life. "Hey, Tom, you see anything weird down there?" Jacob's voice was muffled but audible. "Nah, just the usual creepiness," Tom replied, his voice betraying his unease. "I think I heard something on the 3rd floor," Jacob said. "I'm going to check it out. Keep me posted." Tom nodded, even though Jacob couldn't see him. The basement seemed endless, with the low hum of forgotten machinery still echoing in the distance. He passed a room labeled morgue and paused for a second, feeling a shiver run down his spine. Just as he was about to keep walking, a loud crash echoed from behind him. He spun around, shining his flashlight at the source of the noise. Nothing. Just an empty hallway. Meanwhile, Jacob climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. This wing of the hospital had been untouched for years, with dust covering every surface. It felt like time had frozen here. Medical charts and equipment lay scattered across the floor, remnants of a past that nobody wanted to remember. As he approached the old records room, he heard it. Soft, muffled voices coming from inside. "Tom, you still there?" Jacob whispered into his radio. The static that followed sent a chill down his spine. "I'm heading back up," Tom's voice crackled. "Something's not right down here." Jacob didn't wait for him. He pushed open the door to the records room, expecting to find nothing but dust and old files. But what he saw made him stop in his tracks. The room was filled with old patient files, but they weren't scattered randomly. Someone, or something, had arranged them into neat piles, each one labeled with a date. Jacob picked one up and opened it. The name on the file was his own. Just then, Tom's footsteps echoed from the hallway. He appeared at the door, out of breath and visibly shaken. "We need to leave now," Tom said, his voice barely holding it together. "What did you find?" Jacob asked, not moving from the spot. "It's not what I found. It's what's following me," Tom whispered, glancing behind him. Before Jacob could respond, the lights flickered, and a cold gust of wind blew through the room, scattering the files across the floor. A shadow passed by the doorway and both men froze. Voices Jacob had heard earlier returned, louder this time, almost like whispers in their ears. They both turned and bolted down the stairs, their flashlights shaking in their hands. The shadows seemed to chase them, moving unnaturally fast through the narrow hallways. By the time they reached the front entrance, they could barely breathe. As they pushed open the doors and stumbled outside, the heavy air of the hospital lifted, and everything went quiet. Tom looked at Jacob, both of them drenched in sweat. "We're never coming back here," Tom muttered. Jacob didn't need to be told twice. Without another word, they got into their car and sped away, leaving Whitford Hospital and its dark secrets behind. That night was enough to make them quit their jobs. Whatever was in that hospital wasn't meant to be disturbed, and neither of them would ever talk about it again. What do you think happened to Tom and Jacob in that old hospital? Do you think they got too close to something they shouldn't have? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more creepy stories.